I want to introduce our guest for today. Again, topics in the media, and we couldn't do better than Mr. Evan Smith. Have a seat if you would. Thanks for stopping by this morning. I really appreciate it. Wait, there we go. You got your theme music.
I asked about that, so I'm feeling better.
This is one of the very few inducements we have.
You've warmed me up. I didn't get to pick it, but I'm happy to have it. So good.
All right.
Glad to be here.
What we want to do, I don't want to pretend that this is totally off the cuff. So I sent Evan a few questions beforehand that we might talk about. But I want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure.
Tell the class, why would Evan Smith be here for a lecture on media and journalism?
So I've had the opportunity the last 4 years to be part of an experiment in making certain that serious journalism survives in the very complicated environment in which we all live in the media these days. The traditional news organizations have had a harder time, in Texas at least, doing serious journalism coverage of public policy and politics because the economy has impacted those papers to the point that they have to stop doing certain things in order to survive. Yeah. They could have chosen to stop doing college football and high school football, but this is Texas. They can't stop doing that. That's the stuff that actually sells. Over time, what they determined was not selling as well was coverage of serious topics: public and higher education, immigration, healthcare, criminal justice, transportation, energy, the environment. These things that they used to cover, they no longer cover as much.
And in fact, we showed the decline in readership.
Indeed.
At the beginning of the lecture today.
So we started an organization called the Texas Tribune to replace the coverage that used to be in those news organizations with something that we could count on, that would be reliable, that would just be coverage of public policy, politics, and government. And the trick was we'd do it as a nonprofit, as a public service, raise money as a 501c3 to support this kind of work. So I come in as an emblem maybe of a new world, not the new world, but a new world rising up to preserve coverage of serious issues.
That's great. And full disclosure, I actually am involved with the Texas Tribune. I'm involved with their polling work along with Professor Jim Henson. And so I'm not employed by the Tribune.
It's not that we haven't met before.
That's right. That's right. But I am a believer in the mission. And if you get a chance, texastribune.org, it's become maybe the primary source for Texas news. It's been picked up by the New York Times and a lot of other reputable news organizations who are interested in what's going on in Texas, but again, may not have the resources to do firsthand reporting.
We're providing for them what they can't provide themselves to their readers.
Well, could you speak a little more generally about what is the web and internet-based news sourcing kind of done for coverage of politics?
Well, it's done some positive and some negative things. As with anything in the world, you can look at it either as good or bad. And my view of the good side of this is that it has democratized democracy. The idea that the practice of government or the observation of the inner workings of government used to be limited to just people on the inside. People on the outside, even engaged people on the outside, didn't have access to the inner workings of the process the way they do today. What the internet has done, what social media has done, what greater transparency by way of greater access to primary source materials has done, is given the average citizen much more power to control his or her involvement with the process. It's not just at election time, but it's at all times that the average citizen can now interact with government. The internet has provided really three things. It's provided access, accountability, and transparency. Greater access through the two-way communications that we've now come to take for granted with people in power and people in high positions of policy making. It's created greater accountability in that no one can get away with anything these days without some average person finding an old YouTube clip or something that was tweeted or some document that we didn't have access to as recently as a couple years ago to say, wait a minute, you say this, but in fact the reality is that. We can hold our elected officials more accountable as a consequence of our relationship to these tools of communication. And then transparency. I think we know so much more about what's actually going on in the Capitol in Austin or the Capitol in Washington. The wrapper has been removed from the inner workings of government. We can now not just see the sausage, but the sausage being made, per the cliche. So access, accountability, and transparency are things that have come into view for the average citizen. That's a positive thing. The negative thing, I think, and there are many negative things, but the thing I'll name the most is that the incivility of politics has now metastasized. The toxicity, the partisanship, the divisiveness has been made possible by tools of communication that allow an individual to have his identity or his intent, his bias obscured. You now have people who so-called troll politicians on the internet or troll news organizations. They spend all day long, every day, basically spewing hate, spewing bile, and it's made the discussion around policy and politics in this country, around elections and campaigns and candidates, around issues, so much more hostile, so much more incivil and toxic that I think a lot of people have been turned off, weirdly, by this thing that's supposed to actually, and I think to a large degree does, engage them. It has this secondary effect of pushing other people away because it's ugly. And unless you have an obligation to be in this world, you can very easily think this is really not a place I want to be. So I think it's had a positive effect in that it's given people more ways in, but it's also created more barriers to remaining in.
Interesting. We talked a little bit about the change in reportage over time.
Yeah.
You know, from the cozy relationships between reporters and politicians that existed, say, at the national level with the Roosevelts and maybe up to the Kennedys, and then the evolution of that with Vietnam and with Watergate and the rise of adversarial reporting. Do you have a particular take on that? Have you seen that in Texas, for instance? Do you think that reporting changed at a certain point? Has it changed even more recently?
So my time frame in Texas is 22 years. So I go back to the very early days of the Richards administration, Richard as governor. And so I witnessed most of the Richards governor's term as governor, all of the George W. Bush, and up to this point, all of the Rick Perry. My observation is that there are fewer reporters today than there were 22 years ago. There are fewer newspapers. When I moved to Texas, Daron, in 1991, there were still 2 daily papers in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, and El Paso. Not long before 1991, there was an afternoon paper in Fort Worth. I mean, the reality is there were a lot of venues for that kind of reporting. There are fewer today. There were many more reporters covering that stuff, and there are fewer today. One obvious result of fewer newspapers and fewer reporters 22 years later is that there is less competition, or has been, I would say, until the Tribune and some other new organizations rose up to meet the traditional reporters. But up until that point, an example I'll give you, a reporter whose name you'd know for one of the big papers said to me, back in the day when there was a second newspaper in my town, once a week I'd get a phone call at 5 in the morning from my editor, madder than can be about the fact that there was a story in the other paper but not in ours. Right. He had his foot in my behind. Why was that story not in our paper? And it made me a better reporter. And then he paused, and then he said to me wistfully, I haven't had a call like that in years. That kind of competition spurs more adversarial, which you could define as positive or negative.
Right, that's right.
Reporting. The lack of competition has been the greatest problem for Texas, at least until the last couple of years. I think, generally speaking, the press has not had a problem with coziness with people in elective office. I do think the problem has not been coziness, but laziness. The problem has not been that the press is too close to elected officials. It's that reporters haven't been motivated to do the kind of upturning of rocks, the kind of digging that would produce the sort of reporting that in turn would hold these folks accountable. Again, I would say much more so in the preceding 15 to 20 years than in the last couple. We're in an interesting place now, not just because of the Tribune, but I think the level of competition and the level of motivation in Texas to do that kind of reporting has gone up the last couple of years. Maybe people are beginning to hear footsteps again. Maybe people are seeing the opportunity, since so many Texans are on the national stage, to make a name for themselves or their organizations by doing that kind of heavy lifting or upturning of rocks. But I actually think today, the reporting situation in Texas is significantly better, producing significantly better journalism across the board than it has in the last couple of years. Would I necessarily describe it as adversarial? I would say that claims of bias on the part of the media, that we are liberal by definition, are not really right. We tend to be anti-establishment. So right now the Republicans are in power, and therefore we are making every effort to kind of gig them. What people forget is that when Ann Richards was governor, the press treated her very much the same way, and her administration, as they treat the Perry administration, as they treated the Bush administration. It's not left versus right, it's in versus out.
Interesting.
We're out, they're in. Our job is to gig them as the people who are in power. And if it goes back to being Democratic controlled at some point in the future, I expect that we'll be every bit as much gigging them as we've been gigging the Perry folks.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We got to go back to Professor McDaniel. I know, it's disappointing, but we're going to make that transition. Once again, thanks very much to Evan Smith for a terrific discussion.
Good to see you.
All right, hope to see you soon.
Thank you.